Let's get started then. Welcome everyone to the Clean Energy Investor Group webinar on our fresh new report on delivering major clean energy projects in New South Wales, an update on our planning reform agenda, which we've done once again with the assistance of HSF Kramer and with the additional support of RenewMap. We're excited to dive into this. The report was launched earlier this month. It is publicly available. We'll pop a link into the chat as well, but this is an opportunity for us to run through the details. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the entire seminar. If I'll ask my team to just let me know if there are any questions popping up, and then we can get to them. But before we dive into the substance, I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional custodians. I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation in Melbourne. I'm going to pay my respects to the elders past, present, those to come, and extend that to any First Nations people who are on the call with us here today. For those unfamiliar with the Clean Energy Investor Group, we're a boutique industry body. We represent the capital behind renewables. Our members, we calculated ahead of this project, have about 150 gigawatts, both built and in the pipeline right across Australia, and over 50 gigawatts of that is in New South Wales. So a very strong interest in the premier state for clean energy. So today we will dive into where the planning process is at for clean energy in New South Wales, some of the recent work that's come out of our launch of this report and some of the feedback. We'll ask RenewMap and Alex Thompson, one of the founders and CEO, to run through the numbers on how planning has tracked in New South Wales for clean energy projects, both from our first report in 2023 to now. And then we will go through the recommendations in our latest iteration, and I'll ask Peter Briggs, partner at HSFK, to take us through those. As I said, please use the Q&A function. We're very keen to make this as useful for you as possible so that you can understand what we're recommending and why we think this will make a significant difference in turning investment into electrons. The reason we continually come back to New South Wales, it's the largest electricity market in the country. It's still majority reliant on fossil fuels, and in a sense, it's playing catch up when it comes to the clean energy transition. When we first did the report in 2023, we found that some wind projects were stretching out beyond 10 years to get through the planning approval process. New South Wales was clearly the state that was taking the longest to approve clean energy and therefore required the most attention in terms of improving that. And since then, we have seen significant progress. So the first thing I want to just flag, New South Wales is moving in the right direction. Since we've been gearing into this issue, there have been year-on-year improvements, including in the legislative reforms that this current government has brought forward. And the most important of which, I believe, is the Renewable Energy Planning Framework in late 2024. It has delivered some significant improvements. Even just this year, we've seen a new bill come forward around prioritizing renewable energy. So this is important for the current government. We had a roundtable with Treasurer Mookie, who's pictured there on the slide, with our members in Sydney last month. The week afterwards, when he put out some of his budget forecasts ahead of his budget, which will be delivered later this month, he flagged that but for the investment in clean energy generation and supportive infrastructure, New South Wales could very well be in recession. So the investment from clean energy and clean infra is a key, if not crucial, part of the New South Wales economy, and we want to see more of these projects move through the system so that we can actually transition the entire state. In 2023, this was sort of the report we put forward. We made a number of recommendations, and in the 2026 update, we go ahead and assess which ones have progressed, which ones are in the works still, and which ones haven't really been touched. So there's been some significant improvements around visual impact, and around some of the other industry requests, including the private agreement template. There's been some progress around use of different pathways to progress clean energy projects. We'll dive into some of these a bit further on, because where there hasn't been sufficient progress on areas like in cultural heritage and land transmission, we do reiterate some of these recommendations, and then we also move to fresh recommendations as well. So dive into the report if you want to kind of really unpack this. All this is to say there's been some significant improvements. There are some things that the government has agreed to take on that we're still waiting to see if that actually delivers. And there's still a number of areas where we do want to see further progress. I'm going to pass over now to Alex from RenewMap to take us through some of the numbers.
Thanks for the intro, Richie. G'day everyone. My name's Alex Thompson. One of the co-founders and directors of RenewMap. We're a market intelligence platform providing data and insights on energy projects across Australia. And proudly Clean Energy Investor Group's first corporate member. My background specifically is in renewable energy project development. I've worked on the ground in New South Wales, developing large-scale wind projects and progressing them through the New South Wales planning process. And great to be able to share some of the data analysis we contributed to this fantastic work by CEIG and HSF Kramer. And whilst this report focuses primarily on New South Wales, as Richie mentioned, our analysis was more from a national perspective, providing further comparisons and context as well. So projects in the assessment pipeline. Firstly, just like to share a view of the volume of utility scale wind, solar and battery projects that are currently under assessment across Australia through various planning systems. So this includes projects that are assessed both at a council and state level. And as you can see, New South Wales has a significant pipeline of projects under assessment, more than all other states combined, getting close to 300 projects in the pipeline at the moment. Just next slide, Richie. When we look at that same data through the lens of project capacity, you can see New South Wales has close to 90 gigawatts of wind, solar and BESS projects under assessment. As I mentioned, this is through both the state development pathways, but also including projects that are coming through New South Wales regional planning panels and local council assessments. Just a couple of key points to call out here. Over 40 gigawatts of wind and solar projects alone currently under assessment in New South Wales. If you compare that to kind of 15 gigawatts that are currently operating, it's a huge pipeline. We've seen a massive influx of BESS projects and applications in New South Wales. As you can see there, over 47 gigawatts of batteries currently in planning. This has likely also contributed to some of the approval bottlenecks. And outside of just the energy projects shown here, we're also tracking over 6 gigawatts of data center projects that have recently been approved or are currently progressing through the state significant development pathway. So that's adding yet more projects to the pipeline. And just to note, the Western Australian numbers there are pretty skewed by multiple gigawatt scale projects. But we can go to the next slide, Richie. So the important question we're trying to answer and what this report addresses is, why is the volume of projects in New South Wales so much greater than that of other jurisdictions? One key reason, one that will be discussed in detail by Peter after this, put simply, is that projects just stay in the assessment process longer. So at RenewMap, we have undertaken a comparative analysis of average development approval timeframes across Australia over the last 5 years. Once again, just limiting it to utility scale solar, wind, and batteries. From the chart here, you can see that approval timeframes vary by both state and technology, but our analysis showed that on average, New South Wales experiences longer assessment timeframes than any other state. Just diving into some of the technology types, solar, for example, on average, took 3 years for a solar farm to get approved in this period, 3 times longer than that of Queensland, Victoria, or South Australia, even longer for Western Australia. From a wind perspective, an average approval timeframe of 3.5 years, not dissimilar to Victoria, but significantly longer than counterparts in South Australia, Queensland, and Western Australia. Important to note that this data only shows projects that have actually received an approval. So, of the 45 or so wind projects that are currently still in planning, some have been under assessment for, well over 5 years. Just one more slide, Richie. If we reduce the assessment timeframe to just the last 12 months, we can see that some of the recent positive changes to planning laws in New South Wales have had some impacts. Notably, solar approval timeframes have come down a lot, but the analysis still showed similar trend with New South Wales approvals taking longer than other states, aside from onshore wind in Victoria there, where a couple of large wind farms were approved last year that were submitted back in 2018. So that's a quick summary. I should say that whilst approved, not approved classification, it's a fairly blunt instrument when you're considering the complexity and nuance of renewable energy approvals. But this aggregated data provides some good insights and trends across the industry as well. So happy to take any questions on that or at the Q&A session at the end. Thanks, Richie.
Thanks, Alex. And just to add to that, we did look. The reason we looked at the 5-year period originally is that was to compare with the 5-year period we looked at in 2023 to see the trend lines there. And there have been improvements, particularly in wind, when you compare those 2 different 5-year periods. And we have worked this report in consultation with Minister Scully and the Planning Ministry in New South Wales. And the recommendation there was to also look at the last year to see how some of these approval changes, how some of these reforms from the department have actually filtered through. And you can see some significant improvements there, as Alex pointed out, on solar, but you're also seeing now more battery projects come forward and battery projects taking even longer. So it does come with a bit of a mixed results. All that's to say, regardless of which timeframe you look at, when you do compare it to the other states in the NEM, and over in WA, New South Wales is still the outlier. Since our first report in 2023, there have been numerous waves of reform that the Minns government has brought forward. We saw this with the Renewable Energy Planning Framework in late 2024 and the numerous updated guidelines for wind, solar, community battery sharing, community benefits, batteries, a whole variety of reforms to improve the DA process across the board. Last year, we saw a further wave of reforms in late 2025 that also delivered another wave of improvements. And even earlier this year, we had the Prioritising Renewable Energy Bill, which is still yet to be passed, which will allow clean energy projects to be identified and prioritised through the planning process, including greater use of the SSD pathway as well. And so we are seeing this government take seriously the concerns being raised by industry, and we do want to flag that has been appreciated. And we deliver this report in the spirit of really trying to ensure that New South Wales can make the most of the clean energy interest and the strong pipeline that Alex has identified. So to take us through what the new report recommends, I'd like to invite Peter Briggs from HSFK, who along with his team really helped pull this analysis together. Over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Richie, and thanks for the statistics, Alex. That was really useful. I want to acknowledge, obviously, the great work we've been doing with CEIG. We really like working with CEIG and its members, and the report that we've helped pull together is really based on feedback from principally from members, but other people in the community as well. So acknowledging your support and participation, I think, has been really critical. Also, my colleague Bridget Reinberger, who's going to help me co-present this session, who's an excellent colleague and someone who's really quite passionate about the sector as well. So Bridget and I will sort of guide you through some of the recommendations, which flow back to, as Richie said, the report we started some years ago. And echoing what he said, I really think the government's done some great work since the Labor government has been here in trying to help things along. Of course, there's more to do, and I think there's a willingness and a commitment to do that, as seen from the planning reforms that have stalled in the upper house, but I think will make a difference. So opening this session up now, I'd just like to say if anyone has questions or would like to interrupt, please do. You don't have to wait till the end. So if things jump into your mind, by all means, raise your hand and put something in the chat, and then we can, Richie, if you want to field those, we can sort of deal with them as we go, or save them for later, whatever you prefer. So, as Richie said, here's a snapshot of the 11 recommendations, which we kind of boiled down based on a bit of a report card on where things were, what we'd recommended previously, and how far we'd got. And we boiled that down, did a bit of a report card on where things had got to. And then this is really, I guess, the essence of the recommendations that we think, based on feedback from members and our experience, we think will make a big difference to moving things along. This is not in the context of dumbing down assessments or, not assessing impacts on the environment properly. That's the cornerstone of our planning system, and we obviously endorse it. But there's some natural drag that's occurred because of some design features of our planning system that are particularly problematic for large-scale renewable projects like wind farms in particular, where you can see the numbers that Alex has referred to. This is not a lack of diligence on the part of the department. That's not the message. It's actually inherent in the design of the system. And there's a conservatism in the way the department administers the Act for good reason, because they get conservative advice from lawyers like us who say, well, if you want to protect the project from a legal challenge, then you really need to be more rigorous. So look, I just want to make that point up front, that this is not meant to be a criticism of the Department of Planning at all. It's really in the nature of feedback, which I think has been received very positively based on what I've seen. So we might that's the snapshot of the 11 points. What I might do is just move on to the next one straight up, which is really about one of the key reforms that has been introduced in the last 12 months, and that is the IDA and the DCA. These two agencies are sitting within planning, and it is hoped that they will really help speed things up a bit. I think the design model of this concept comes from the Coordinator General type role that used to exist in New South Wales, still exists in Queensland, where there's a sort of agency that can pull things together, because one of the drags on the system has been coordination as between all of the agencies who feed into an assessment of a project. And the role of the IDA and the DCA in this, I think, is potentially very significant. It's early days about how all this is going to work, and I think the renewable sector is very supportive of this. I've got a number of clients, and I know members of the team, the membership of CEIG, who've been accepted into the IDA groups, and
Peter,
so far, getting. Yep.
I think just to add to that, just in
Yep.
strong support, I think of the first tranche of the 16 projects supported by the IDA, I think 13 from the clean energy space. So there's obviously been a strong interest as well, which has been great to see.
Fantastic to see. And look, Richie, I'm not sure what you're hearing, but the feedback I'm getting from clients is really positive. The initial steps it's been really refreshing. It's a sort of can-do approach. How can we help? The challenge is going to be how the DCA works as well. And the DCA is potentially going to streamline particularly the RFIs, the request for information, that in the SSD planning pathway, as members of and people on this call will appreciate, that process has happened right through an assessment over many years. And there's this constant flow of further requests from agencies, which a lot of proponents are surprised by because new issues are raised as the assessment goes on. I think it's hoped that these two new bodies are going to help streamline all of that. And I guess the key recommendation here is, look, this is great. Can we please have some resources to back this up to make sure it works and to make sure that the two agencies can act quickly and decisively and that they're properly resourced and so things don't get stuck there. And I think the other thing is also sufficient expertise within these two groups. Obviously, there'll need to be specialists who deal with biodiversity and various other things, but having some in-house expertise that is really top-notch, I think, is also critical. And of course, that takes time to put in place and will take money, and access to qualified experts. So I think those recommendations so far, I think, have been received well. Richie, has been my perspective on things. So I don't know whether anyone has any comments about either of those things based on practical experience so far with the IDA, but I think it's a positive sign, and I think with the right resourcing, this can really help. Okay. I'm assuming, Richie, if there are any questions coming up or comments, you'll field those and pass them back.
Yeah, that's right. We have the team sort of checking the chat to see if anything pops up, and we'll go ahead and verbal it.
Right.
There has been one question in the chat not related to this slide, but it might be one for Alex. You might have seen this. Is there a breakdown within the overall assessment or approval timeframe that distinguishes the time taken by proponents and regulators in completing their respective responsibilities?
Yeah, probably not within the analysis that we've done. It might be a question for Peter, just more on the SSD process and statutory timeframes on particular steps. I don't know if you have anything to add there, Peter.
Look, it's my hobby horse, so don't get me started, Alex. Look, I've been advocating. We're sort of jumping to the next slide in a sense, but we'll take it in steps. There's a fundamental problem with the SSD planning pathway for large-scale energy projects, and particularly linear projects like wind farms or transmission. And that is because the system sits in Part 4 of the Planning Act. And that is, it's a highly complicated legal maze that you need to go through. And if you don't apply the right level of rigor in that assessment, then what can come out the other end is a project that could be challenged very easily, or a project that could end up in the Land of the Environment Court on a merits appeal. So a lot of the numbers around the SSD projects are quite large because of the nature of the pathway, which is one of the reasons our recommendation for some years has been, let's move some of these projects over into a more streamlined pathway. If you want to jump to the next slide, Richie, we're sort of jumping ahead on that. I'm not sure if that answers the question entirely, but I'm happy to take a supplementary if that helps. But maybe we just dig into this one. This was really, I think it's probably the most important recommendation of all of the 11. That the SSD pathway has its problems. We called that out some years ago. And as I've said, it takes time because of the nature of the requirement to assess. Now, some of the planning reforms that have been imposed under the tranche of reforms late last year will go some way to helping the SSD pathway for those projects that stay in the SSD pathway, the State Significant Development pathway. For example, the very subtle changes to section 4.15 that relate to the level of impact on the environment, which is a really simple concept, but has justified on very large projects very detailed assessments of things that people might say, well, why are we assessing in minute detail these sorts of issues on a big linear infrastructure project? The answer lay partly in the requirement of the Act and those mandatory considerations. Part of the reason for suggesting the SSI/CSSI pathway for these sorts of projects is it's much more flexible. What can be considered is much more discretionary. There's a whole raft of things that can be considered, not because you want to dumb down an assessment, but it gives huge levels of discretion to the decision maker to take into account matters, including to adopt a very pragmatic approach. And so if you see an SSI project approval for a very large project like a transmission line, that assessment will be quite general in its approach. It will be indicative and it will have broad concepts. The pathway lends itself to that kind of that need for flexibility in a large linear project, as compared to the SSD pathway, which is much more designed for a development of a house on a block of land, in Western Sydney or somewhere. It's a different kind of scale of project. So we've been pushing this recommendation for a while. I think it's getting some traction, and I think the recent planning reforms that have been stuck in the upper house, I think, telegraph a willingness to use the SSI pathway a bit more readily. Now, there's a difference between CSSI and SSI. I don't necessarily want to go into. The slide here kind of highlights some of that, and we can certainly go into it if we want to. I think the reticence about the critical SSI pathway is that it turns off too much from the perspective of perhaps Department of Planning. That is, it makes it too difficult to enforce and too difficult to challenge the project. We probably don't need to go that far, and an SSI declaration would get us a long way down the track, give us more flexibility, and make assessments simpler. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be cheaper necessarily, but EISs are still going to be rigorous, and they're going to be, they'll take some time, but it should simplify what needs to be assessed. And I think it's going to make a huge difference to timeframes. Now, I'm happy to field questions about that because there's a lot more you can say about it. I'm conscious of time, but I think we've got some green shoots emerging in the government indicating that this is something that they will embrace. Any questions about that? Bridget, did you have anything you wanted to add to that particular commentary?
No, I think that's covered everything for that one.
Yeah, good. The little table on the side, Richie, I'm not sure if you're circulating these for later, but it's a good ready reckoner that gives you the pros and cons of the various pathways. And you can sort of see that the SSI pathways, it's getting us a long way down the track. Okay, the next recommendation. This is one of our favourites, and I know people on this call. I've spoken to many of you about this problem. SEARs, start off, you've got to get them, and to get them, there has to be consultation with a bunch of agencies. And that process itself can take a long time, which is partly why it takes a long time to get a project started, because you've got to do your preliminary assessment, you've got to pitch that scoping document, that's then got to produce the SEARs, and there's a process of consultation. Now, that's all good because it produces a bespoke kind of set of assessment requirements for a project. But what we're finding is that a lot of this could be simplified, we think, and streamlined. SEARs can be made more prescriptive and accurate in what they're seeking, and hopefully with the result that you can do your upfront assessment and then not be swamped with a continuous series of RFIs that go right through the project, and which then naturally increase the cost, but also massively increase the time frame, because every time you get a further RFI, it's effectively a new SEER. You legally have to comply with it, have to deal with it. That's a whole bunch of experts. It's a whole bunch of further consultation. You then have to go back to planning, and so it goes. And if this happens throughout the whole project, that's obviously a massive source of delay. So the thinking is better resourcing up front, and that's where those two agencies right up the front, I think, can help Richie, quite significantly. If they're properly coordinated and properly resourced, we should be able to streamline this process. And really prescriptive outcomes focused SEERs that actually give greater expectations up front about what is required in the way of assessment. Now, one of the trends we see here is that there's more and more and more upfronting of assessment, which is difficult for some projects because there's a budget and it costs more upfront before you get very far down the track. It's a bit of a trade-off because doing it up front obviously potentially saves you time later. So a bit more clarity around all of that, we think, would really make a huge difference. And hopefully the new agencies are going to really help with that process. So that's probably enough on SEERs. Bridget, would you like to have a think about would you like to say something about the RFIs, which was the next recommendation?
Yeah, sure. So this is sort of a related recommendation to the one before on SEERs, and it goes to RFIs and sort of how to minimise and streamline those. In addition to making SEERs more prescriptive, we think there's room for improvement in terms of the department's existing commitments. So they have in the Renewable Energy Planning Framework, which was released in November 2024, made commitments around limiting major RFIs to once per stage of development, so once at the EIS stage, once at assessment, that kind of thing. And so we think delivering on those commitments would make a huge difference in terms of timing and certainty for proponents. And I think when you combine sort of the presence of the DCA and IDA, as well as making SEERs more prescriptive, I think it'll make it more achievable to reach those commitments that they've made in the renewable planning framework.
Yeah, and I think the recommendation that's sort of highlighted on the slide there about measuring all of this is a good idea. It's a sort of a performance measure, I think, that would really be worth publishing. And let's hope the DCA is able to do that for us. So that's enough on SEERs. Now, this is another favourite topic for people. The IPC, the Independent Planning Commission. It's a great body. It's set up to create some independence from the department, and so it's a creature of the department. But it's independent, and it has an independent reviewing and decision-making function. And obviously, there's reasons for having this. It's obviously a bit of transparency. It's a bit of a distance from government. So there's a sort of I guess a sense of independence. It's not a court, but in a sense, it acts a bit like a court or a tribunal in hearing information. There's been all sorts of problems though with the IPC, and it's not a criticism of the IPC per se. It's just another drag on timeframes because you go through a massive assessment process. You get recommendations from the department. Then, if you have more than 50 objections or one council objects, the matter is sent to the IPC under delegation for a decision. And that's in some cases can add 9 months. Now, I was criticised by the department for using that, saying that was a time frame. And it's not necessarily typical, but I was personally involved in a matter, very prominent one, where the IPC process took 9 months. And the reason it took 9 months is because, of course, at the IPC, everybody has an opportunity to be heard. The IPC may have questions. And so another round of assessment and another round of expert reports and cost occurs, and it takes time to deal with it. So it was a good outcome at the end of that process, but it's a 9-month delay to the project. And is that really necessary? That's obviously partly a political decision, but look, what can we do about it? It's a creature that exists. Well, one thing is, I guess, thinking about the thresholds for when something goes to the IPC, because on any major project, it is very easy for a handful of opponents of the project to get 50 people to object. That's really easy. It doesn't matter where they come from. It doesn't matter, they could be in Iceland for all we care. They could be in a different state. So potentially some thresholds, whether it's numbers or some other measure that brings some, I guess, greater, what would you say, common sense to this process about when something is going to go to the IPC. And possibly, you know, some sort of weighting system so that, you know, people who are local people probably have more weight than others. I mean, it's very difficult, as people on this call know, that there'll be a very small handful of objectors who are very mobilised and very well resourced and able to muster a lot of people to object. But anyway, that's a system. We've made some suggestions about that, and I think it's probably something that's on the agenda, Richie, to think about how this is going to, how it's going to unfold. And I think we've had a good reception to the question that I think government realises this is potentially an issue.
That's right. And we understand the role of the IPC is to give another vehicle for people to have their concerns raised, and it does provide that function, and it's an important function. But I guess it goes to the point around the thresholds, like, does it pass the pub test? Like, is it reasonable to have most complainants come from well outside the region or even the state? Are there ways that we can refine this so that it can still provide that vehicle for concerns to be raised from those who will be impacted, versus is it being used or weaponized as a block on development? And we think that there's a better balance that can be struck.
There is. Look, public participation and, you know, transparency is the cornerstone of the planning system, and it's to be encouraged. And, you know, participation in the decision making is what the whole system of environmental impact assessment is about. In the case of an SSD project, let's say a wind farm, the public participation starts with, you know, submissions or objections to the EIS, can continue throughout the process with additional questions, further objections, all of which the proponent has to deal with. There's then another opportunity when the matter goes to the IPC, and the IPC hears the matter in a sense in a public forum, and there's another opportunity to participate. And then, of course, if in the case of a wind farm or a BESS of a relevant size, if the IPC approves the project, having gone through all that process, then the project, one objector is able to take the project to the Land and the Environment Court as a merit objector. Now, that is a huge amount of public participation. Query whether the Act is really designed for that. Is that really meant to be how it works? Happily, we've seen a recent trend in the department of referring projects that might otherwise be sent to the IPC for a public meeting. They've been sent to the IPC for a public hearing. There's very little difference between the two, except that a public hearing will turn off merit appeals. It will mean that the decision of the IPC is the decision, and there's no recourse to the Land and the Environment Court on the merits. Now, that's a big development. We've had the first handful of wind farms referred to the IPC on that basis. It's very common in other sectors, but it hasn't traditionally happened in the case of wind farms, but it has recently. So that is a very positive sign. What it means is that those projects won't be amenable to a merits appeal by an objector. They could still be challenged in the court if there's a legal error. If someone wants to bring a Class 4 challenge in the Land and Environment Court, they could do that, but it's going to turn off merit appeals. So I think that's a very positive trend. And I think some other working around which matters actually have to go to the IPC will make a huge difference to timeframes, but also legal risk for the project. Okay, that's probably enough on the IPC. Bridget, do you want to deal with this one?
Yeah, sure. And just quickly on the IPC as well, I think the government has flagged in the release of the recent planning amendments in April that they are intending to make changes to the planning systems set to change the triggers for IPC referral. So that's sort of a wait and see on that one. And then so for this slide, our next recommendation was to really explore the possibility of moving matters to the post-approval stage. So Peter referred to before this idea of upfronting, and we're seeing an increasing trend of proponents being asked to provide a lot of detail before a project's even assessed. And so we think there's a real opportunity to explore with the department of, what needs to be done for the assessment and what can reasonably be done afterwards. With the introduction of model and standard conditions, which were introduced as part of the earlier planning reforms, we think there's a real opportunity there to sort of work that into the system where you sort of make it clearer and more certain for proponents as to what you'd have to provide and what level of detail you have to provide at the assessment stage versus later down the track. So we think that's an opportunity that the New South Wales government can leverage where they've already sort of started down that track.
And Bridget, this wouldn't be an invitation to just ignore significant impacts of the project, not at all, but rather where it's possible to deal with things by way of standard condition to streamline that. And I think the SSI pathway, if it's adopted for some of these, particularly the linear projects like wind farms with those sorts of linear components, I think would have a huge potential to simplify things. To give you an example of what we're talking about, we've had a number of projects where there's challenges raised to the level of assessment of stormwater impacts from normal construction of a wind farm. And not in particularly sensitive areas or whatever, but just a desire, or I guess a third-party challenger saying, well, there needs to be a more rigorous assessment of stormwater. Probably these things can be dealt with on any major project, any major government project that's linear. These are standard conditions. And we know what the Blue Book says, and we know how to manage stormwater, and there's an engineering control, and you can condition these things to mitigate that risk. That's the kind of thing we're talking about that could be streamlined, simplified, adopted universally. It's already happening in relation to, say, government projects. Why can't it happen in relation to these renewable projects? Why do we have to be going into the weeds on so many minute details? Okay, so the next issue is sodas. Bridget, this is one for you, given that you're definitely a soda guru.
Sure. So our next recommendation was to broaden the use of sodas. A soda is a strategic offset delivery agreement, and they were introduced in the last year or two as a mechanism whereby proponents could enter into an agreement with CEIG to, they would basically pay money up front, and then CEIG would go off and implement the relevant sort of biodiversity mechanisms, whether that's acquiring and retiring credits or other kinds of projects that benefit the impacted biodiversity values. And the real benefit of sodas for proponents is that entry into a soda satisfies your consent condition on biodiversity impact. So it creates timing and cost certainty for proponents. Currently, sodas are there are only certain projects that are eligible for them, and they're listed on the screen at the moment. But we think there'd be an opportunity to expand that to all renewable energy projects in New South Wales, or you could apply it to something that has access rights as well, or sort of provide further limitations. But we think there's a real opportunity to help renewable energy projects progress, because that's something we regularly see with clients, is difficulties in finding the required offsets. And so it's a real opportunity to sort of help with that timing piece around biodiversity offsets.
Conscious of time, let's just jump to the next couple. So we've got we've kind of already touched on this one. I think it's a really obvious recommendation. Removing appeal risk on the projects that are currently amenable to a merits appeal by an objector, that is wind farms, the kind we'll be talking about, and many BESSs, most BESSs in fact. Each of those projects at the moment, if they're going down the SSD pathway, could end up in the Land and Environment Court on an appeal by an objector if one person doesn't like the project. And that's after the years of public participation we've talked about. So we've been pretty strident in this recommendation, which is against the interests of lawyers, I might say, Richie. Yes, but ultimately good for the industry. And I think that is being heard. The fact that we've had 3 wind farms referred to the IPC for a public hearing is a good sign. If the SSI recommendation is embraced, then it would follow because they won't be amenable to merits appeals. So I think that is a pretty good recommendation, and I think one that is being listened to.
Good to hear you taking one for the team there, Peter, on that one.
There'll be plenty of other things for us to do, I'm sure.
I'm sure. We haven't even started talking about.
That's right.
Yeah.
Look, post-approval, this is obviously an important one. Post-approval support for clean energy projects. And this is really about timing certainty, whole of government, the coordination type roles we've talked about before, DeFi, IDA, DCA, and other agencies really providing that after-sales service. Can we call it that? So it's a sort of, what can they do to help make this move along rather than, the alternative. Secondary approval processes, obviously, as well, given that they're mostly dragged into the SSD or the SSI process, and potentially statutory timeframes for those secondary approvals where relevant. And finally, before we go to questions, this is really quite a startling number when you see it. New South Wales is the very most expensive place to lodge a DA. And it is extraordinary how much it costs. There are so many barriers to entry into this market. First of all, you've got to pay for your EIS, and our report looked at some of the costs of doing that, Richie, which you'll remember. Startling numbers in terms of how much it costs to actually prepare an EIS. But then to add insult to injury, there's a massive cost upfront. Now, look, I think it's not necessarily about the cost itself. It's very often the timing of the cost in the cycle, because there's so much time that's needed where the project is carrying the cost of the approval and getting land access and all those sorts of things that are being borne before you even have an approval. So something around the staging of payments would be workable, potentially some tweaking the fee calculations, and then also some clarity around some ambiguity that exists. Look, I think this is a no-brainer if New South Wales wants to be a more attractive place for investment, because this is a barrier to entry. It's so startlingly different from other states. Queensland, it costs about $17,000 to lodge an application. So anyway, that's...
Yeah. I mean, you can hardly even see Queensland on this chart.
No,
Peter, in terms of the costs versus New South. And I mean, this was raised multiple times in the Treasury Roundtable we had. It's been raised multiple times with me. I mean, you can, as some of our members do, have similarly sized projects that they kicked off around the same time in terms of the DA process in 2 different states in the NEM. And one will face fees in the hundreds of thousands, probably even closer to 100,000. New South Wales would be in the millions. So a significant, and the most part of that will be upfront as well, which really does change the balance in terms of how they have to structure their finances. So we've had a good amount of, we've pressed this issue, and we've had some interest in actually looking at what the New South Wales government can do, both through the Treasurer's Office and through the Planning Minister's Office, to improve the situation for proponents. And so I do have to say that of all the recommendations, this is one where I think we're going to get traction sooner rather than later. So stay tuned in this space.
Well, that's really a wrap on the recommendations themselves. So look, obviously over to questions, and Richie, you might like to field them.
Yep, happy to have turned off the shared screen, and we'll pop open the Q&A function. I see that there's one or two that have popped up, or just our own ones. Well, look, maybe to kick things off, Peter, what the reluctance to use the SSI and CSSI, like where do you see us going in terms, like we've had these discussions around, but does it ultimately come down to sort of a broader political appetite to try and push this? And it gets down to a broader question that we've had, and it's not just for New South Wales, this is most states and at the federal level. Like, do you have whole of government commitment to deliver on the ambitions that they've brought forward? And are you willing to actually prioritize the processes to deliver on them? And be interesting to get your thoughts on how that's been received.
Look, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we first recommended that the CSSI pathway was going to help, and that was picked up by the government in the 2024 guidelines, as people will remember.
But with quite a high threshold.
Very high threshold, but at least there was a glimmer. there was a hope, and I know some people sort of oriented their projects around that, and pitched the idea, but it didn't receive traction. Pumped hydro, yes. Floating gas storage terminal, yes. But a wind farm, no. I think my sense is that there's more willingness, and I think I read the tea leaves by looking at the planning reform that's currently stuck, because those reforms, and Bridget, you might have thoughts about this, those reforms, in a sense, the declaration of those projects or the recommendation of those projects by the energy minister sends a signal. This is of great state significance, guys. It's then over to the planning minister to make the declaration. Legally, it can be done with a flick of a pen today. We don't actually need the reforms, but the reforms will help in the sense that I think they create a clearer pathway that this is a very significant thing for New South Wales. So there's both ministers are sort of involved in the process. I think there is a willingness to use SSI. I think that the reluctance around the CSSI pathway has been that enforcement is difficult. And there's some, I won't mention names, but there's some case studies around that we could talk, that are available. And that reluctance, I think, is a concern that it'll also be a perception that they're giving free kicks and whatever. And I don't think that's what industry needs. I think what is needed is a clearer, legally more certain, hopefully faster and less expensive process, still really rigorous. It's not going to cost $9.99 to do a CSSI EIS. It's going to be expensive, but it's going to give, I think, sufficient degree of public confidence, but also comfort to the sector. So I'm hopeful, and I think that planning reform is a good sign. We're heading in the right direction, but of course it does involve bringing the hand to the signature on the declaration. And whether that, I mean, I think it could be done, it doesn't have to be done on a project-specific basis. It could be done on a capacity basis, for example, if you meet certain thresholds. So I don't know whether others have thoughts about that.
No, I might ask Sydney to jump in, who's been our lead at CEIG on all this New South Wales planning reform work.
Yeah, this kind of goes to the earlier question on time spent with government and time spent with proponents, but Jacob White has just popped in the chat some useful numbers. So for the 8 wind projects, the report points to New South Wales, about 8.7% of the time was government days, 41% was EIS prep with the proponent, 19% response to submissions, and 21% RFIs, 10% the IPC process. So those are really interesting, especially in the context of those recommendations that you just shared, that you just walked us through, Peter, because a lot of those sort of point to helping with EIS prep, making that more efficient, lowering the number of RFIs and IPC process as well. Any other thoughts on those numbers that Jacob just shared?
And for context, Jacob works in Minister Scully's office as an advisor, responsible for renewable energy in particular, just to give that context.
Yep. Yeah. Look, I think it's really useful to get those numbers. It's not as I think it's not as simple as saying, oh, it's government time and it's private sector time. They're being slow. I don't think it's true of either party, by the way. I think it's just a combination of factors. And I think if the recommendations are embraced that we've talked through, I think it'll be faster when in private hands and faster in the government's hands. I think it'll be both. But it's a multiplying effect at the moment because you've got the SSD pathway. I know there've been changes made to the SSD platform through the last year's planning reforms. Those subtle changes to introduce the word significant into assessment of local impacts, right? Impacts on the environment. The problem is that little change potentially is going to be great and will save and simplify and make things easier. But it's going to take several years of court cases and you probably know the Court of Appeal to tell us what that actually means before it's really going to make a difference to timeframes. Because in the meantime, the safe thing to do will be to do the same sort of rigorous assessment that's happening now. So some of the changes will take a while to filter through and will be good. More needs to be done, and the SSI pathway is a really good start. The other recommendations will help. And look, the people I deal with, and many of them are members, these are not cowboys. These are people who spend serious money on getting high quality assessments. And the best you can get in the market. But if you're constantly asked to do further RFIs, it takes time to do, and you can't do a bad job of that. You have to do a rigorous job of that. And it can't be a criticism of someone that an RFI has been raised a couple of years after the EIS and it hasn't been addressed earlier. That's not necessarily a problem of the proponent. It's and I'm not taking sides. I'm just giving my views.
There's another question in the Q&A that kind of goes to that point that you just mentioned, that these changes will take a couple of years. Chloe's asking, how should developers progress their projects through planning whilst we're in limbo of potential PEP SSI pathways opening up, but not yet being finalized until the prioritizing renewable energy bill passes?
Yep, it's a great question. I'm afraid you at the moment you're in the SSD pathway, and that means you've got to bulletproof your project. There's no promise that you won't end in a merits appeal. So you've got to think about that from the beginning. And you're going to have to apply the same sort of rigor. And I think the advice would be upfront your assessments, do as much as you can upfront and explain to the business why that's a good investment and a good idea. Because it would be dangerous to assume that you can just simplify things because there's been an amendment to section 4.15. So that would be my suggestion. And look, I think the hope is that we'll get the planning reforms through and then that we'll see a rash of projects that enter into the SSI pathway and that other reforms will happen. And, these things will have an accumulating effect. I think that together, this could really make a big difference.
It's good to end on a note of hope, Peter. And look, it will reiterate, New South Wales is going in the right direction. And we have seen year-on-year improvements, and what we're doing is just providing a menu to continue that path. And we're not saying planning is the only concern for turning dollars into electrons in New South Wales. That's the focus of this report. There's many other challenges. We're working through those as well. We've got our big member annual survey coming out next month, which will kind of unpack other concerns and other opportunities in New South Wales. But suffice to say, there is good progress made, more to be done. And a big thank you to my team, to HSFK, to RenewMap, on once again really pulling this together and providing us with a concrete pathway to continue improving New South Wales. So with that, thank you, everyone. And if you do have any further questions, please do reach out. We're always keen to talk about this work.